Sir Karthikeyan Nachiyappan. He is an architect who has graduated from the Architectural Association. His research has been published in many esteemed journals, such as the Indian Concrete Journal. He is the founder and director of Studio of Architectural Urbanism, an art and architecture consultancy focusing on research and development of housing projects in Ooty and in Chennai. His research interests include low-cost housing, architectural space making, informality and slums, inequalities in planning, and policies and urban design.
Welcome to UGC lecture series on architecture. I'll be guiding you through the lecture on the topic of urban housing. For your convenience and understanding, the lecture would be composed in parts. Come, let's take a look at what would be the contents of the lecture today. Housing in architecture and housing production in India are the key topics of discussion of the lecture today, and the remaining parts would be elaborated based on the topics given below. Thirst for a place to dwell have been persistent since time immemorial, when our ancestors started looking for place of shelter in search and in protection for them from natural habitats. The first evolved dwelling unit, as you could see over here, a single cell unit where human evolved, they protected themselves from animals and other natural forces. So, they erected this place that eventually became in a process called a dwelling unit or a house. So, in due course of time, this process started accommodating few other activities. So, this consists of what is called as social life. This has been continuing till the present day. The only difference is that there are more and more influx of people. The scale of need and scale of people has been exacerbated. The search of housing is enormous, and this is what remains as a threat to the society. So, in this course of urban housing, we would be focusing to define housing not as an entity that encompasses social life, but more as a commodity that could be sold out. So, do you think housing is a process? So, is it to produce more houses, replicate more houses, build high rises, build low rises? Today, people in cities live in many kinds of houses, ranging from small to big apartments. A tree house is a concept, a communal garden with row houses, apartments that are small or big. So, there are different varieties of houses where people live in. So, with this, can we define housing? So, let us try to define it. Housing is a process. So, process meaning it accommodates a lot of things. Say the first thing, the social and the cultural life of people. So, it includes the social and cultural life of the inhabitants who are going to dwell in the unit. Next, of course, the economic considerations, which means any person who has a social and cultural background need to afford the house. So, it takes into consideration the economic aspects. So, when these are there, now housing needs a production process. So, housing has to be built. It needs a production time and production process, which is over a time. Then for that production, we need something called as finance. Now, the next question is, who will finance? Government or private sector? So, which means there is a stakeholder who is needed or some investor who has to involve in this process of housing, and at last ourselves, the community. So, with this vague idea or a conceptual thought on housing as a process, to define, housing could be defined as a process that involves social, cultural and economic backgrounds of the inhabitants of the city, that varies between different scales, that requires a production process over time involving financing mechanisms, thus tying up different stakeholders including investors, public sector and of course the community as a whole. Cities have grown. Cities grow either in a predefined way. As the planners intervene after industrial revolution, the planners intervened a lot in setting the pattern or the growth of the city, or historically cities evolve. So, what is now a single dot what was a city now has sprawled. It has grown in all directions, organically or in a defined way. It accommodates a lot of people. So, why has it grown? People from rural migrate or influx into the urban areas. So, this rural influx of people to the urban areas is otherwise termed as migrations. So, now these migrants play a key role in the development and the physical expansion of the city. There are different concepts of cities, like what you see: satellite city, new city, redeveloped cities, a city beyond city, garden cities, metropolis, megalopolis, defined based on the population of the people. So, all these are different categories or conceptual thoughts on what cities are based on different predefined patterns. And of course, these cities have enormous diversity. Cities are composed of neighborhoods, and of course, neighborhoods are composed of urban blocks, and urban blocks have different kind of houses, from parks to playgrounds to retail to commercial to different spaces. Now, there is a rural influx of people into the urban areas where these people are from entirely different social and cultural background. So, when these people from different backgrounds put together or conglomerate in these urban blocks and these different urban houses and retails and commercial spaces, they use it, which means that the city is socially active. And this urban diversity induces the aspect of vibrancy at different scales, may it be a large ground or a playground or a park, to a smaller scale of a house. Cities, of course, support physical expansion and growth. Historically, the conception was, after Industrial Revolution, there is a city and there are suburbs. So, during the World War times, what happens was, city and the industrial part were located in the suburbs, and of course, housing supporting it were located again on the suburbs. Now, as the cities grow, the definition has now been concentrating in terms of an urban core. An urban core can be a historical district, can be a central business district, or it can be some other major place of conglomeration in a city. And that is in turn supported by what is called as an inner ring or older form suburbs, and which in turn is being surrounded by an outer ring or exurbs, so newly formed suburbs. So, cities actually grow in potential corridors or potential rings. What is the meaning of it? For example, take Chennai. Chennai has a potential north south and east west corridor. It starts from Fort St. George historically. Take Bangalore. It grows in concentric patterns like the urban core, inner ring and outer ring. And now, since there are more influx of people, the cities expand horizontally as well as vertically. All these focus down to a question on what is urbanization. Now, this image is a very good example of urbanization, lights, city. But before that, where does it start? It starts from our rural hinterlands, where people in the village look at the cities, look at the modern outlook of how cities grow, and think that there are potential opportunities over here in terms of job markets. So, in search of these local employment opportunities that cities provide, people from the rural hinterland leave out their agricultural jobs and start migrating into the cities. Now, this migration is the first step in the process of urbanization. Once people move, they search jobs. A positive aspect is that they get jobs and settle, and a negative aspect is that they still search. Now, all these lead to a formation of a slum or shack settlement, and that is also a process or end resultant of urbanization. Again, the problem of slum and urbanization, everything points to the question of where is housing? People move from rural to urban. So, the question becomes very exponential in terms of where do we provide housing? Where is the land to provide housing? Urbanization is a process that has been continuously evolving and evolved historically in developing cities and developing countries. Now, according to Mitchell, urbanization is a process of becoming urban, that is, moving into cities, changing from agriculture to other pursuits common to cities. Now, let us just define what are the causes for urbanization. Industrialization, as we were talking about, growth of industries in cities make people in search of job or employment opportunities migrate. Second, social factors and modernization. People in cities have a different outlook within themselves. They have a social life, they have a different cultural life, they have a modernity in them, they have a modern style or trend in the way they express themselves. So, this makes the rural people more interested on what kind of life they need in cities, and this is the end resultant of urbanization. Now, this transition between the rural to urban has a lot of problems associated with it. The first being problem of overpopulation and overcrowding. Disintegration of joint family. Again, this also relates to the question of housing, because joint family in a rural hinterland, when there is a house, say for example in an acre, 16 to 20 people occupy the same house in a joint family system. Now, 2 or 3 people stay back in the villages and the remaining 15 to 18 people migrate in search of new employment opportunities or say a modern outlook. Now, these disintegrated families take a possession of housing in different places in the city. Now, the demand of housing actually increases. The third problem is cost of living is more. Next, increase in crime rates, of course. Problem of pollution is exorbitant and stress naturally. This interesting map, one on the left is based on the census and one on the right is based on Geopolis. On the left reveals that the urbanization rate is very less, and on the right reveals that there are more cities which are being urbanized. There is a problem with the census data, which means, in other words, there are not many people or not many migrants registered themselves with census data. So, the census data reveals that hardly 5% of the cities in India are urbanized more than 50%. The blue indicates urbanization rate above 50%, and according to Geopolis on the right, you could see a lot of blue dots around. So, which means that more than 30 or 35% of the cities in India have already been urbanized, meaning more than 50% of the population of those states have migrated from rural to urban areas. This graph indicates the levels of hierarchies. So, we have been talking in all these data about rural and urban. Now, this gives you an idea on what are all the various strategies or different hierarchical positions between the rural and the urban. So, you could start with small hamlets till a mega city, and in between you have hamlets, small villages, medium, large sized villages, and different tiers of cities, large metropolitan, and finally mega cities. So, these are all classified based on population, and this interestingly reveals that the percentage of small hamlets and hamlets have considerably decreased over the past 7 decades. So, from 1951 till 2011, you could see the proportion decrease from 21 or 22% to 3 and 8%. And interestingly, there is a marginal increase in the growth of mega cities from 3 to 4%. And the major part or the transition, which I would call it as peri-urban, so that is in between the medium and large villages, have grown from 5 to 17%. So, this is called as a peri-urban condition, where this is a state of transition between rural to urban. Now, housing becomes an urban challenge. There are different urban challenges, but since we are looking more on housing, we will just look at how housing becomes an urban challenge. The first thing is about building regulations. Building regulations, there are set of rules where our city corporation limit or different governmental organization impose, where that limits floor spaces, indexes, and reduce the number of houses. So, when there is more demand and in reduced number of houses, the property prices push up. Next, outdated rent control acts. It reduces the access for poor people to pay these marginalized rents. Poor access to microfinance and mortgage finance limits the ability of low income groups to buy or improve their status. On a large scale, policy, planning, and regulation on a larger scale has to take into consideration how much amount of people move in, and of course, since these policies are little more unclear, there is, or it helps in the growth of proliferation of slums. Weak finances of urban local bodies forget to provide infrastructure needed for us, meaning the social infrastructure as well as mobility infrastructure. So, now since housing has become an urban challenge, this indicates that there is a growth in everything. As this metaphorical diagram says, it deciphers increase. Increase in what? Housing demand increases, housing growth increases, more population increases, social factors are in search of different needs of the housers and dwellers increases, increase in crime rate, increase in pollution. So, all these are tied up with housing, and that is why I already said housing is a process. Housing is just not a commodity which could be sold out. Of course, it is, but more than it is a process. It ties up a lot of things attributed to it. Now, some of the urbanization facts that you might consider to remember. 3 out of the world 21 megacities have already been in India. One is Mumbai, Delhi and Calcutta, and now Mumbai hosts around 20 million, that is more than 2 crore population at present statistics. Large cities have grown from 23 in 1991 to 40 in 2001. Slum population is about 41 million in 2001, which is almost one third of the population. But now the estimated slum population by 2017 would be 69 million. That is, at least half of the population would be in slums. So again, slum is nothing but it is an informal housing. This also ties back to the question of where do these people live. So housing as a commodity is needed everywhere. Role of housing in architecture is very key. I mean, it becomes more crucial when lot of influx of people start living in what you see in these images. Shacks or settlements or otherwise slums or informal housing. So these people basically lack an adequate shelter to protect themselves from natural forces. They lack sanitary conditions. They lack access to safe drinking water. They also lack insecurity in tenure arrangements, meaning they neither rent it out nor own it. So it means that they are vulnerable to forced eviction. So they can be taken out at any time. So this relates back to the concept of gecekondos in Turkey. So Turkish word of gecekondu means in one night everything disappears and the next day it reappears. So these forced evictions are not only in countries like India, it is faced in many developing cities and developing countries. Housing becomes crucial and on three scales to relate: at a policy or an urban level, a neighborhood level, at a planning level, and at the most smallest level. Housing has to be thought as a component of neighborhood and planning. So as you could see, these three scales are very important in terms of deciding what is the role of housing. So at a more politic level or at a more political level, housing has to be incorporated as a strategy to provide different developments at different places, and housing has to be composed of neighborhoods which promotes community living. The problem in developing countries is that there are a lot of social inequalities, meaning people don't have, half the people have access to something and half don't have, and half negligible. So there are different inequalities in social life and there are different hierarchies of people, say higher class, lower class, and there are different social stratification. So housing as a strategy should include all these inequalities into consideration at the more holistic level. And now housing at a smaller scale has to promote communal living. It has to incorporate different ingredients which brings in different classes of people. Now the question between that puts in the mind of architects, planners, and of course policy makers are: how do we check quality on housing and standards? Because none of the housing in developing countries are of a particular standard. It deteriorates over a period of time. Does the housing get integrated with the neighborhood or remains isolated? Many housing complexes which are being provided say 20 kilometers away from the city still remain isolated because the urban local bodies don't give the proper mobility infrastructure to come back to the city, because the employment opportunities are within the city. Next, how can we make housing complex a part of urban? So these three are the key questions any policy maker or planner or an architect should keep in mind when designing housing as a strategy. Coming back to real estate sector, it is one of the most growing sectors in India, and almost it has been projected that 30% would grow in the next decade. And of course, after agriculture, this is the largest employer. So the housing market and the real estate sector is always well linked, and West has always well established connection with the corporate sector as well as different office space requirement, urban and suburban environments. So it has always grown to accommodate different growths, but even the real estate sector grows. What is the component of housing in it and how housing can be a part of it? Now just for your understanding, let's look at what is the real estate cycle in India. Imagine this is the cycle. So there is something called as boom, real estate boom, meaning there are high capital inflows. So high capital inflows meaning it pushes up the property price, it pushes up the construction rate, it pushes up all the interest rates on home loans, and there is a demand. Then the next process is nothing but contraction, which means that the vacancy rate is high. So after a particular period of boom, there is high vacancy rate, meaning the demand is met. Now, there is more vacancy in construction. This period is called as contraction, and this eventually leads to what is called as recession, a common word which we come to day, which means that there are high capital outflows. This indicates that reduce in property prices, reduce in construction rate, reduce in interest rate in loans, and there is a lot of housing that has been empty. Now, after a period of time, the last process is called as recovery, where again the construction goes up, more people need houses and people start moving in. So, conceptually this is called as a real estate cycle in India, which has 4 phases. Okay, let us take a look on property and real estate market and outlook. So, take up few cities like Delhi, Chennai, Surat. Now, the property prices or the rate of construction in Delhi has gone down by 1.49 percentage. In Chennai, it has gone up by 12.58 percentage. In Surat, being the maximum, 17.89 percentage. Take out Chandigarh, it has gone down by 5.67 percentage. Coimbatore, it has gone down by 7.61 percentage. So, all these are possible. The property markets are dictated by 2 things. One is because of slow economic growth and high interest rates in home loans. So, these are the 2 conditions which actually dictate the real estate market. Now, India's housing boom era, since the last decade, there are a number of IT industries that have grown. So, from 2000, you could see a lot of cities like Hyderabad, Chennai, Bangalore, Delhi, Mumbai, all these metropolitan cities getting more people and has received more migration from rural areas in search of these IT market. So, now these technological advances have led to the more boom in housing industry because there is a requirement of house. Growth in terms of special economic zones, SIPCOT and all these outer fringe new developed areas require more people and these need housing to stay. So, there is a persistent economic growth which has been seen in the mid of the decade, which rated up to 8.9 percentage per annum, and slowly a speculative boom was found by 2006, where in Mumbai the property prices were pushed up almost 100%, 100 times the cost of an average income. Now, finally at this stage developers started looking at to more affordable housing, and Tata Housing developed a small project in Chennai which relates to affordable housing. Then now the economy quickly rebounded, again the house prices started increasing. So, everything is dictated by the economic growth of the country. So, housing is always tied up with this economic process. Housing a need, third world example. This states that there are no easy solutions to the third world housing diverse problems because a lack of adequate shelter is merely one of the manifestation of generalized poverty. So, when the economic condition of a normal person doesn't increase, which means that he lives below poverty line on an average poverty line, he cannot afford a house. Decent shelter for all can never be guaranteed so long as there is widespread poverty. At the same time, sensible policies can help mitigate shelter problems. This interesting graph shows how the population has grown in terms of urban areas. The first map shows the decadal growth for the past 6 decades of urban rural population. So, in 1951, there were 1/6 of the population living in urban areas. The green indicates urban areas and the blue indicates rural areas. So, the population was around 62 million in urban areas in 1951 and the total population was almost 361, that is 1/6, and over the time it is increased where 377 million in 2011 are staying in urban areas and out of 1210, which means that 1/3 are living in urban areas and this condition will still increase. And the next graph shows about what are the permanent structures and non-permanent structures over the decades. So, in 1961, as you could see, half the houses in India were permanent and half were non-permanent, and slowly it increased in 2011 where you could see a lot of concrete houses and a little bit portion of rural housing. This graph indicates a decadal growth of housing shortage, which means that 2001 to 2005 till 2011-14 till present stage, as you could see, the red has constantly decreased and the blue has constantly increased. The blue indicates urban population and red indicates rural population, which means that probably in a 5 or 6 more years the rural and urban population will be balanced, which means that 50% would be urbanized. A conceptual image dictating many people run in search of houses. Many people are moving in. Where do they stay? Without a place to stay, of course, they settle back in what is called as a slum or a shack without access to poor facilities. So, what could be done for this? This again indicates what is called as housing demand. When the demand is more, people run in search of houses, and when they don't get it, this leads to housing shortage. There are reports saying that supply of cheap housing has risen with 30,500 units built between June 2011 and January 2012 based on 132 projects in 22 cities. There is also a statistics indicating that there is a need of 15 million houses for an income level between 10 to 25,000 a month in India. So, now let us try to define what housing need is. Housing need is nothing but growth in household. When of course family rises, there is a need in housing. Migration, we were talking about this aspect. Present household conditions. So, when people try to improve their conditions in housing, there is a need. Then at last, rise in standard of living. When their incomes increase, so there is a need in terms of housing. Now, let us define what housing demand is. There is a minor difference between what these two are. When there is an inaccessibility to housing, when people are not able to access proper housing, this leads to housing demand. Then the next point is ability of the household, which means that when they rise in status, their ability will result in demand dictated by purchase power. So, when their purchasing power is more, they can afford proper loans and interest rates. So, this also increases the demand. Next, of course, affordability. When people can afford more houses, this will also lead to demand. Then finally, what housing supply is about? Housing supply is nothing but alterations, upgradations. So, when these rise in income levels do, so they do purchase new houses or they alter new houses. It is otherwise called as improvement in housing stock. And of course, extension is also a part of it. So, now just statistics reveal that housing shortage at the beginning of the 11th 5-year plan is 24.71 million units, and additional plan required according to the 11th plan was 1.82. So, this results in a total housing of almost 26.53 million dwelling units. This is a short conceptual graph that indicates that when the demand rises and the supply falls, when more people come and the demand increases and there is no proper supply of housing, the prices of housing increase. And on the other hand, when the demand falls and supply rises, then of course the price falls. When there is more houses already being built and there is no demand, of course the price falls. Finally, to conclude, what happens in our country is that the demand for housing is always in the high income group is always less, and the demand for housing in the low income group is always high. So, always promoters and developers promote this kind of housing by additional high stocks, because the profits here are more, profits are increased. In this sector, profits are always less. So, this always dictates the promoters to build more high income houses, but the demand in our country, the actual housing need is what is in the LIG context. To sum up, so today we looked at what is housing and housing production in India, and more on an outlook of what real estate sector and property markets are, and housing as a process as well as it is being an integral part of neighborhood and cities. So, key questions to be thought upon would be: how does housing play a key role in architecture and planning? What is urbanization and explain its causes? Explain housing demand and analysis. How does housing market influence housing production in India? And define housing as a process. So, further directions in research would be as mentioned. So, One key thing which you might want to look at is totality in housing and few examples of housing in developing countries. So, that would give you a more indicative research on what are the conditions of housing and housing as a process. So, let us look at more details on housing and housing policies and schemes in further lectures. Thank you.